Thanks, Minister. I know that any ministry, it's a challenging job, and Alberta faces a number of dynamic, changing things as we grow and take on more population. But you did talk a little bit about. I just kind of want to go in the same vein as my honourable colleague from Calgary-West, from the official opposition. Just in terms of, you talked a little bit about demographics, and as Alberta starts to grow, the economy comes back. Where in your budget, so you talk about demographics and you obviously look at those things, and we know that there's a fentanyl crisis and that's going to continue to happen. There's issues with mental health. We talked about the Me Too movement and other things. Where in your budget, obviously you try to budget the best to your ability, where in your budget, if these things continue to increase, is there a reserve plan to, again, put more boots on the ground?
So you mentioned a couple of things there. I think when we're talking about the fentanyl crisis and when we're talking about things like mental health, certainly the police have a role to play, but I think they will agree that in large part, I mean, I hear them say all the time, we can't enforce our way out of this problem. So a lot of that money, in my view, is better placed in health. Right. Certainly, I think it is important that we continue funding those enforcement agencies like Alert that sort of focus on this type of crime and keeping a close eye on it. But I mean, we'll continue, I think, to monitor the situation. But most indications that we're getting currently, even from our policing partners, is that the important investments right now in terms of the fentanyl crisis are in sort of mental health and addiction services.
Right. So again, just the question was, is there any kind of reserve funding for any type of crisis when it comes to rural crime or spikes in crime or anything like that?
Well, obviously, we'll be willing to go forward with that, but we try to give the most accurate picture we can of the budget, so we don't try to sort of hold a quote-unquote slush fund back. Right.
Fair enough. Now, is there some sort of, you did talk about fentanyl and the crisis and everything, and you're absolutely right. A lot of that does need to be handled within healthcare, but obviously you can see how the two ministries dovetail when it comes to that particular issue. When you talk about the economy, with domestic crime and those type of things, we know have been on the rise, especially when the economy is not doing so well, which leads to the fentanyl crisis and other mental health issues. So is there a task force, and who is talking on a regular basis with health, how they combat that, and again, making sure that our police officers, in these particular areas, aren't spending a lot of time in emergency waiting rooms dealing with mental health patients, and so that they're out there to fight crime.
So there is actually ministerial tax. Opioid Commission, sorry, I'm trying to remember the exact term, and certainly our policing partners work in conjunction with that in order to share information. I think, the situation is evolving quite rapidly, and our understanding of the situation continues to evolve. So certainly, that which is situated in health, but a number of our policing folks sit on that as well. I think another investment, and this wasn't in year, this was in your last year, but we have invested in terms of having additional medical examiners and in terms of having additional support staff in the medical examiner's office, because they're keeping a lot of that data for us, and I think that data is really critical in terms of how to address the situation going forward.
Great. So just one of the things, we know that cannabis sooner or later will be legalized with the federal government, and I know that your department's working forward in a plan. Has there been any discussion around people who are currently in the justice system for offences of small possession of cannabis? Has there been any conversation at all to stay those charges and move those people out and to free up any Crown prosecutors when it comes to just small possession when it comes to cannabis, which will eventually be legalized anyway?
So there's a couple of different things going on there. So one is that, and this is a little bit complicated because sometimes charges are combined with other charges, but generally the Prosecution Service of Canada prosecutes Controlled Drugs and Substances Acts, so those are federal prosecutors. So those conversations would have to occur ultimately at the federal level. But I guess my message to folks out there is that at this moment it is still illegal. So govern yourselves accordingly.
Right. So on page 101 of the business plan, and your key strategy 1.3 refers to the need to prepare for the legalization of cannabis. So what additional costs can we expect related to the legalization of cannabis?
So there's a couple of different things, and some of them are still, unfortunately, moving targets. The deadlines on this one were a little a little rapid, but we think that we'll be ready nonetheless. So obviously some of those costs will be borne in the AGLC for setting up and regulating the system. We are expecting that there will be costs when they do approve a screening device. We don't know exactly what those costs will be, but those are sort of screening testing devices for impaired driving. Those will be costs, in some cases falling on the province, in some cases falling on municipalities. But of course, those municipalities, as I'm sure you're aware, are looking to us with respect to that. And then there will be costs to the healthcare system as well.
Okay. Now, are those numbers reflected in your estimates at all in terms of the additional cost?
Well, obviously, many of those things. So the AGLC resides in finance. Alberta Health Services will be within healthcare. And since we don't know when, if, or what device will be approved in terms of the screening devices, we're sort of we don't have those numbers at this stage.
Right. And again, just kind of back to what are the numbers around investigating and the ongoing nature of policing cannabis right now? Are those costs in the budget, or are you going to start weeding that out as cannabis becomes legalized?
Well, I think
Excuse the pun.
Weed those out. I think I think it's very difficult to separate one crime type in that way, right? To say that an officer is necessarily, doing a certain thing with a certain amount of their time. Our police partners right now are more concerned that there will be additional strain on policing resources as a result of additional impaired driving cases than they are thinking that they're going to have their workload lighten. But obviously we'll monitor that as things go on, as time goes on. We don't have really good data from when Prohibition ended, so we're not totally clear on how those things will shift.
Right. Okay, thank you. Obviously the opioid epidemic is a serious issue, an ongoing crisis. Where in your line items does it contain any policing related to drug offenses and opioids specifically? Is there a line item in your budget at all dealing with that?
So certainly, you'll see that within 6.3, which is that's ACERT. Within alerts budget. So they are serious and organized crime. So that's line 6.8. So they do a lot of that sort of integrated policing and communication. Again, a lot of that is ultimately going to be seen in the health budget, and also, federally, I'll let them deal with border services, but that's also not specifically related to our budget.
So in your relationship with policing departments, throughout the Alberta community, and all our communities, what is their response? Are they asking for more officers? Is there a desperate need, obviously, to combat some of this opioid crisis? Are they asking your office for more funding?
Well, I think many of the conversations I have, and I don't want to speak for anyone, but many of the police services, certainly police governance has a very good, I think, in my view, understanding of sort of how addictions and mental health work. And in a lot of cases, what they're suggesting is that what we really need to see is, again, those increased investments in mental health, those increased investments in housing services and those sorts of services. So certainly, I think, everyone can always use more resources, right? That's, I guess, the challenge of governing at the end of the day is determining how to best allocate those resources. But often in their conversations, what they're suggesting is that, dependency treatments and those sorts of things are a good investment in that way.
Right. Page 102 of your business plan, you talk about how important it is to make sure that people feel safe and supported during their interaction with the justice system, specifically making sure that Indigenous and Métis people are included in the process. So what measures are there in the budget to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the justice system?
Sorry, I could go on for so long. So certainly that's, I think, something that's reflected, and I think it's important to note, it's reflected within sort of our ministry, but it's also reflected across the provincial government. So a lot of that support, some of it can come from victim services in terms of individuals specifically interacting with the justice system. Some of it comes in terms of RCAS, in terms of individuals within the court system who can help navigate individuals through the justice system, because we know that those individuals are disproportionately likely to be Indigenous folks. It's also, you'll see sort of supports that come within correctional services, so they run a lot of really good programs with respect to that as well. But I think it's also critical to see that, everyone needs to sort of move together on this one, right? So in terms of ensuring adequate health services on reserves, in terms of ensuring adequate mental health services, in terms of ensuring adequate access to education, those sorts of pieces are going to play a huge role. So because the problem has complex drivers, I think it would be hard to say, oh, it's only in this area. It's probably distributed throughout.
So can you tell the committee how many police services are on our First Nations and reserves in Alberta, and how closely does your office work with them to deal with the very issues that we're facing in all our towns and cities?
So by and large, primarily we're dealing with the RCMP. There are also 3 First Nation policing services throughout Alberta, and we were actually very happy to see enhanced positions on reserve through the RCMP, or those First Nation policing services are funded in partnership with the federal government. And for years and years and years, the former federal government had not allowed any increases. So not only had they not allowed new folks to join with respect to enhancements, but they hadn't allowed an increase in the per officer cost, and that put a huge strain, not only on the RCMP, but on our First Nations policing services, because they weren't getting funded enough. Right. And so the federal government has just recently committed to change that. So they're going to start by looking at the per officer funding, and then they're going to allow sort of new entrants to that position. So as that comes on stream, we'll see increased costs, because those are split 52-48, and so we'll see sort of increased costs on our end, but it'll depend, who wants to enter into those agreements, and how much of that funding from the federal government ultimately lands in Alberta, because we'll need to contribute some of ours as well.
Right, and again, just when we talk about the disproportionate amount of people, in the justice system, from our Indigenous communities, is there a task force that your department works with to work with our First Nations communities to come up with key strategies to reduce crime and address issues along with your partners in health, and I would assume in municipal affairs and Indigenous relations to deal with the issues on our First Nations?
So I would say there's a number of different groups that are working in this area. So we do have some groups that are dealing with sort of victim services. We have some that are dealing in terms of corrections and policing and sort of supports going back and forth. We have some cross-ministry ones as well, but there's I think a number of different folks who are working on this issue, and obviously a lot of the work is run out of Indigenous relations as well, with respect to when you're talking specifically about Indigenous folks.
Okay, so Alberta Justice Stan Soljan was given about $2 million in 2015 to consolidate a data about missing and murdered Indigenous women across different police services. Has that report been released yet? And where is that report at all?
Sorry about this.
Okay, well, they talk about it. I'll ask you another question.
Sure, that sounds great.
So how much are you seeing an increase to Alberta human rights, more submissions? And how is your office specifically working with that department to make sure that there's access for everybody and that Albertans know how to access that particular issue to ensure that their human rights are preserved?
So there is a small increase in terms of year-over-year funding in terms of Alberta human rights. We definitely are seeing, each year we see a few more cases coming forward through the Human Rights Commission and tribunals. We are seeing, increasing number of complaints. There is a small increase in funding. I think this is one of those, I will admit, I think challenging decisions where getting the right amount of funding can be a bit of a challenge, right? In light of the fact that you're seeing claims increase and you're wanting to keep cost increase to less than population plus inflation. We're also doing some work, so we're currently recruiting to a new chief. We're doing some work to look at the Human Rights Tribunal to make sure that we're in addition to increasing funding, we're also making sure we're doing business a little bit better so that we're maximizing return for Albertans.
Okay, very good. I just kind of want to go back to rural crime. It's obviously a serious issue, and it seems like a bit of a plague in central Alberta and it's throughout rural Alberta for sure. So my question is, you talk about the contract that you have with the RCMP, and I think Alberta, we've got a proud history of being mavericks and making sure that we get things done and we do it our own way and we come up with an Alberta solution. At what point within your department and within your government, if this contract with the RCMP is not working and they're not meeting the criteria that you've put forward, would you look at another solution? And I guess the other part too, is there a timeline attached to dealing with these issues? Because I think rural Albertans really need to know that there's something going to be concrete put in place with the timeline rather than it just go on and on and on.
So there's a bunch of things wrapped up in there. I do think the RCMP take this issue seriously and they are working to address it. Obviously, again, as our understanding of crime moves forward, the way we police moves forward, I think we will see sort of impacts start right away. Certainly the pilot on that crime reduction unit in central Alberta has had very, very good results. So I think we'll start to see those results quite expeditiously. But, crime, the thing about crime is you can drive the line down, but you're never going to get the line to zero. So it's difficult to say there's a point in time at which, that will come to an end, I think, in that way. But certainly we're looking to see that reduction. I think the challenge with what I imagine you're alluding to is a provincial police service. The challenge with moving to that model is, first off, there would be a lot of startup costs in terms of getting, because, we have under just our contract over 1,500 officers. So getting those bodies into place would be a bit of a challenge because those folks are RCMP officers, so presumably they go elsewhere in the country. There's also the case that, so presently for that portion of Alberta that's policed under that contract, the province pays 70% of the costs and the federal government pays 30% of the costs. That wouldn't necessarily be the case if we changed models.
Correct. Yeah, no, I think the question was, if it wasn't working out, would you, just have the fortitude to move on, come up with a different solution. So just another quick question about rural crime. So how much money is actually being directed towards the hiring of new Crown prosecutors in rural Alberta right now?
So the announcement with respect, the announcement we made with respect to rural crime would be to add that $2 million. And so you'll see sort of that's between roughly 8 and 10 prosecutors. We don't know yet exactly where those individuals are going to be deployed, but we'll be looking to make those decisions fairly quickly.
Okay. Now, are they mostly junior Crown prosecutors?
So again, when you flow money in, we sort of make an estimate on roughly how much an individual costs. So some will cost more, some will cost less. It depends who we're able to recruit and when we're able to recruit and where we're able to recruit them to.
Right. So what is the average caseload of a Crown prosecutor in rural Alberta? And with this hiring, how much do you expect that caseload to decrease?
Obviously there's a number of factors that drive that. My understanding is that currently the average, so obviously it differs by area, but my understanding is the average is roughly 500, I think, in terms of cases being carried in rural Alberta there we go. Sorry, I'm gonna pass it over to my deputy minister.
Phil Bryden, deputy minister. So, we've been doing a fair bit of analysis of caseloads in different areas, and
Sorry, thank you. The time allotted for this portion has expired. I would